In recent years, Berlin has once again become a major destination for heterogeneous movements of migration, including refugees crossing the Mediterranean to escape the war in Syria, as well as many migrants from the crisis and austerity-ridden states of Southern and Eastern Europe or Latin America. They complement those migrant populations who have found a place for themselves in Berlin over the past decades. No small number of these newcomers, as well as older generations of migrants, find jobs with digital platforms like Deliveroo, Helpling, or Uber. This is no coincidence and in no way exclusive to Berlin. Without the huge contingent of migrant workers across the world, there would be no global gig economy as we know it. The workforces of the gig economy platforms in Berlin and many cities across Europe and the world are constituted by an overwhelming majority of migrant workers, a fact that is only recently getting more attention in the debates around platforms. Our interest and our perspective on the gig economy in turn stem from critical migration research, a perspective on contemporary societies and global capitalism that we have been contributing to for many years. Our research on the gig economy and our project that we started over 3 years ago builds on previous projects in which we have researched how the mobility of labor transforms itself under conditions of digitality and logistics. This is something we continue to analyze with the case of gig economy platforms in Berlin and 6 more European cities in recent years. We understand and research these platforms as an encounter between, on the one hand, new and hyper-flexible forms of platform labor, and on the other hand, new patterns of temporalized, flexible, and variegated mobility and mobility structures of labor. And this is indeed something that we have been learning from the perspective of lived experiences of mostly migrant workers. Based on extensive ethnographic research on platform labor and migration, and over 40 interviews with platform workers in Berlin in 2 different projects, our contribution sets out to describe and theorize the relation of the gig economy, stratified labor markets, and migration in the specific situation of our city and beyond. Today, we thus aim to present an analytics for the gig economy from the perspective of mobile labor. This entails both a view to the ways how digital platforms are able to attract migrant workers and what allows the platforms to manage them effectively. We want to argue that the very characteristics of the gig economy, conceptualized as a combination of algorithmic management and flexible employment relations, make them perfectly suited to tap into and exploit migrant labor. Hereby, we are secondly concentrating on the perspective and experience of the workers and their engagements with platforms in the context of their mobility projects and the stratified labor market. When we firstly take a look from the perspective of platforms, what we find is that the talk about so-called Uberization, the becoming infrastructure of platform, which makes them a domain of power, sometimes obscures the fact that all these platforms interact and have to interact with existing urban economies and infrastructures. With the complexities and ambiguities of what cities and cityness are constituted of, to use the words of Saskia Sassen. And of course, these platforms have to interact with labor, with the existing people as infrastructure to use, or maybe to misuse, the wording of urban anthropologist Abdul Malik Simon. By extending the notion of infrastructure directly to people's activities in the city, Simon goes beyond the common notions of infrastructure, normally including things such as streets or cables. Simon includes city dwellers as another form of infrastructure, but a peculiar, unruly living form of infrastructure. They, the people, as he points out, always do something different than is specified by domains of power. In this aspect of the platform economy we are tending to here. In our research, we are able to investigate both how the functioning and profitability of labor platform in Berlin relies on tapping into the given workforce of often disenfranchised, migrant, often racialized and gendered populations, and how at the same time such populations try to use platforms for their purpose in mobility projects, something that entails everyday forms of resistance and sometimes open contestations of the platforms and their logics. For platforms like Deliveroo, Uber, Helpling, and many others, migrant workers constitute indeed a crucial given infrastructure of people willing to accept unstable and precarious conditions of work. And in many cities across the globe, these platforms would not be functionable without them. It should be mentioned here that in different sectors and also in different phases of the automation of labor, think of the Ford's factory, migrant labor has always had an important place. Also, the importance of migrant labor to the service, gastronomy, or taxi sectors of Berlin and many other sectors is nothing new. Therefore, we have asked ourselves how, if at all, do digital platforms add new qualities to these industries and sectors? In fact, as we want to argue, the labor model of the digital gig economy is geared perfectly towards the exploitation of migrant labor. It does so by combining new digital technologies with sometimes very old forms of governing contingent and mobile labor. The systems of algorithmic management employed by the platforms via their apps allow for the semi-automated organization and control of labor. Through the apps, there's very little training necessary, and a high level of control of the labor process is easily achievable. Algorithmic management hence produces a first precondition for the inclusion of a very heterogeneous group of workers into a tightly organized production process. In the case of digital platforms, these mechanisms of algorithmic management only really develop their effect and efficiency in combination with flexible labor arrangements, i.e. the forms we all know of self-employment, of the outsourcing of entrepreneurial and social risk onto the workers that is typical for the gig economy. And this very combination, the combination of systems of algorithmic management and their possibility of the semi-automated management, control, and measurement of labor on the one hand, and on the other hand, the contingent employment relations of independent contractors paid by the piece wages. This combination is the core of the gig economy. And this is also the combination that makes the gig economy geared perfectly toward the exploitation of mobile workers. The platform workers need only minimal training, language skills, or supervision as they are navigated by the app through urban space. Under these conditions, a high fluctuation of the workforce is no problem, but rather part of the calculation of the platforms that can count on a latent reserve army of migrant workers who can be allowed into and expelled from the platforms with minimal costs and problems.
With this logic in mind, how does this present itself from the perspective of labor? Here we see that platforms often constitute an entry point into labor markets, especially for new migrants coming to the city. I always thought that it was an option working in Deliveroo even when I was in Chile, says Sebastian, one of the riders we interviewed, and as he tells us, that amongst the migrants from Chile and Argentina, most of whom come to Berlin on a one-year visa like Bastian, it's quite known that both Helpling and Deliveroo are the easy jobs to apply to when you come with a visa because you only have 1 year. And this is very immediately. You don't need that much papers and you don't need to speak German. The point he mentions already expressed his knowledge of why gig economy platforms are an option many migrant workers turn to. Most platforms have a quick and unbureaucratic application process with very little formal requirements concerning language and other qualifications, documents, or skills. Many platforms, we have found, even dispense with application interviews and only ask for a minimum of registration papers, work permits, and similar documents, and have little mechanism to control the existence of these papers. For many, especially recent migrants, whose documentation, visa and permits would not suffice at other jobs, digital platforms are thus a quick way to start earning money. Another major problem for many migrants coming to Berlin, they tell us, is the German language. The availability even of precarious and low-skilled jobs becomes scarce, and many find that their options diminish substantially without basic German skills. As the gig economy apps often work in several languages and are quite simple to operate, this offers possibilities even to those who speak no German or English. As Bastian explained, the option to work for such platforms is common knowledge among young people from Chile or Argentina wanting to come to Germany. Some did similar jobs, sometimes for the same platforms in other countries before, like our interviewee Francisco, another delivery rider and part-time industrial climber who worked as a food delivery courier for Deliveroo and Uber Eats on 3 different continents. In these cases, digital platforms add another layer to what we have discussed and researched in migration studies as migration infrastructure, building on the work of our anthropologist colleagues, John Biao and Johan Lindquist, who described them as the systematically interlinked technologies, institutions, and actors that facilitate and condition mobility. Looking at the gig economy from that perspective of migrant labor then entails shifting the focus. Firstly, from a historical perspective, low pay and precarity are nothing new or exclusive to digital platforms, but have been the characterizing conditions for migrant, racialized, and gendered labor for decades. The history of flexible and contingent labor is closely entwined with this history and present of migrant labor. That means that instead of addressing platforms only as an innovative disruptor of standard employment, it becomes necessary to discuss how digital platforms are actually able to renew and reconfigure forms of contingent labor and how their specific digital qualities concerning, for example, algorithmic management and new forms of control interact with stratified labor markets. Secondly, such a perspective allows a situated analysis of gig economy platforms in labor markets constituted by differential migration and labor regimes, including multiple dimensions such as citizenship, language, visas, or work and residency permits. From the perspective of migrant workers, these labor markets are often characterized by little alternatives, to quote Bastian once more. But at the same time, this is the only option that the immigrants of people from Chile or people from India have. Like, they cannot work anywhere else. So even though the work conditions are shit, it's the only thing they have, the only opportunity. And I was earning even more money than in any other job. So for me, I was really happy with it. And as long as I didn't get hit by a car, everything was going to be okay. Here we see both the precarity and insecurity of platform work and the importance it has to many migrant workers. In the case of Bastian and many others, this translates into many tricks and forms of resistance trying to use the platforms as good as they can. Here, people constitute an unruly, lively infrastructure for the platforms. And these workers continue to make themselves visible in strikes and protests across Europe. In the spirit of Bastian's quote, we want to underline that there's no reason to celebrate gig economy platform for the chances they give to migrant workers. The perspective of migrant labor, however, reminds us to see them in a long genealogy of contingent and precarious labor that reaches into the present. From this perspective, we shall try to analyze and address digital platforms not as an exception, but from a broader scope, both analytically and politically. To conclude, in our research, the gig economy platforms in Berlin provide an entry point for migrants struggling with stratified regulated labor markets, requesting language skills, and so on. The ability of platforms to digitally organize, control, and measure migrant labor that is sitting on people as infrastructure, on the other hand, allows the semi-automated management of heterogeneous workforces that are easily scalable according to fluctuating demand at almost no cost. With a view to these dynamics and the workforces of gig economy platforms, perspectives from critical migration studies are indispensable for researching the contemporary gig economy. Critical migration studies are not only interested in researching specific migrant groups, but also how migration and labor regimes produce migration in the first place. Labor platforms contribute to create what we have elsewhere called logistical borderscapes. Logistics organizes and governs the movement of people and goods and increasingly asserts its logic across the entire circuit of production, distribution, and consumption. Today, it is more and more a form of economic planning, rationality, even a form of knowledge, inscribed and constitutive for the gig economy that fits so well into these emerging borderscapes. Seen from the lived experience of migrant labor and the history of migration, we know that migrants' lives are always to be considered in their constituent ambiguities. The freedom that is expressed in the search for a better life elsewhere, even if by making a living through labor platforms at times becomes a battle for freedom by trying to detach migrant lives from concessionary conditions set from platforms, but also from migration and labor regimes. Thank you very much.